The silence of the Arctic Circle was not broken by an explosion, but by a sound that would later be described by sonar technicians as the shiver of the deep. At 03:14 local time on October 14th, the Norwegian frigate HNOMS Thor Heyerdahl, patrolling the edge of the Svalbard exclusion zone, detected a thermal anomaly that did not correspond with any known seismic activity. Within seconds, the ship's Aegis combat system flagged a signature, a Bore-class ballistic missile submarine, the Knyaz Vladimir, moving at a silent crawl just 12 miles off the coast. The encounter was the spark that the world had feared for a decade, yet it began with a technical glitch. A faulty sensor on the Heyerdahl interpreted the submarine's reactor cooling discharge as a torpedo launch. Following the aggressive defense protocols recently established by NATO, the frigate's commander authorized the release of 2 Mu-90 impact torpedoes. The underwater detonations were felt as far away as Longyearbyen. The Knyaz Vladimir was not sunk, but its outer hull was breached and its communications array was shattered. In the distorted logic of nuclear command and control, the Russian Northern Fleet interpreted the strike not as a localized error, but as the opening salvo of a decapitation strike. By 06, the Svalbard incident had metastasized. In Moscow, the General Staff invoked Protocol Zenith, a rapid deployment directive that saw the immediate mobilization of the Sixth Army toward the Finnish border. The world woke up to a digital landscape that was already disintegrating. A massive, coordinated cyber offensive, later attributed to the Sandworm unit, paralyzed the electrical grids of Poland and the Baltic states. Streetlights flickered and died in Warsaw. The high-speed rail network in Germany ground to a halt as signaling servers were overwritten with encrypted ransom notes. In Brussels, the North Atlantic Council convened in a bunker beneath the NATO headquarters. For the first time in history, Article 5 was invoked, not against a terrorist entity, but against a peer-state nuclear power. The declaration was made at 09:45. By noon, the first air-to-air engagements occurred over the Suwalki Gap. A flight of 4 American F-35A Lightnings scrambled from Lask Air Base intercepted a formation of Su-57 Felons. The engagement lasted less than 6 minutes, fought at ranges where the pilots never saw their enemies with their own eyes. 2 Su-57s were downed by AIM-120D missiles. 1 F-35 spiraled into the Belarusian forests after a short-range infrared seeker hit its engine. The geography of the war expanded with terrifying fluidity. While the world's eyes were fixed on the Baltic, the Mediterranean became a theater of slaughter. At the port of Augusta in Sicily, the USS Gerald R. Ford was preparing to depart when a swarm of Zala loitering munitions, launched from a disguised freighter in international waters, impacted the flight deck. The explosions did not sink the carrier, but they ignited a chain reaction among the parked FA-18 Super Hornets. For 12 hours, the pride of the U.S. Navy sat as a burning pyre, its specialized fire suppression systems overwhelmed by the sheer volume of thermite-based explosives. In Washington, President Miller addressed a joint session of Congress. The speech was devoid of the usual patriotic fervor. Instead, it was a clinical assessment of a civilization on the brink. "We are no longer in a period of competition," Miller stated, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the teleprompter. "We are in a state of existential persistence. The lines we drew in the sand have been washed away by the tide of total mobilization." Following the speech, the Defense Production Act was expanded to include the seizure of all domestic semiconductor and autonomous system manufacturing. On October 16th, the conflict entered its most brutal phase, the War of the Peripherals. In the high north, Russian paratroopers landed on the Lofoten Islands, seeking to establish a bastion zone to protect their damaged submarines. NATO responded with Operation Iron Petal, a massive amphibious counterassault led by British Royal Marines. The fighting was characterized by a horrific fusion of 20th-century trench warfare and 21st-century robotics. Soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes, while autonomous Stalker ground drones, 4-legged machines equipped with thermal optics and 7.62mm machine guns, stalked the tree lines. The drones operated on Slaughter-bot algorithms, identifying heat signatures and firing without human intervention to circumvent the jamming that had rendered remote control impossible. In the forests of Estonia, the 1st Armored Brigade engaged the Russian 76th Guards Air Assault Division. The sound of 120mm tank fire was constant, but it was the silent killers that caused the most psychological damage. Miniature quadcopters, no larger than a bird, would dive vortex into the open hatches of tanks, detonating shaped charges that turned the interior into a furnace.
By the end of the first week, the global economy had ceased to function as a coherent system. The Great Blackout had expanded to the United States, with the PJM interconnection grid failing after a series of physical attacks on high-voltage transformers by unidentified sleeper cells. Gas prices reached levels that made private transport impossible. The dollar plummeted as the SWIFT banking system was taken offline to prevent a total wipeout of global ledger data. In London, the Thames embankment was lined with anti-aircraft batteries, their barrels tracking the gray, overcast skies. The civilian population began a mass exodus from the cities, fleeing toward the countryside in a desperate search for food and security. Yet there was no safety to be found. The orbital front had opened, with killer satellites using kinetic harpoons to shatter the GPS and Galileo constellations. Navigating the world became a matter of maps and compasses. The digital tether that had bound humanity together for 30 years was severed. In the Pacific, the tension between the U.S. and China, though not yet at the level of the European theater, began to fracture. A zone of exclusion was declared by Beijing around the entire South China Sea. Any vessel, civilian or military, entering the area was targeted by DF-21 carrier-killer missiles. The global supply chain, already reeling from the European collapse, was effectively strangled. In the bunkers of the Pentagon, analysts looked at the red map, a visualization of the world where nearly every major shipping lane and communication cable was either cut or contested. The hour of uncertainty had passed. The world was now in the age of attrition. Commanders on the ground were given autonomous release authority, allowing them to use tactical assets without confirmation from a central command that might no longer exist. This was the moment the war stopped being about ideology or territory and became a self-sustaining machine of destruction. The machines were fighting, the algorithms were targeting, and the humans were simply trying to survive the momentum of their own creations. As the sun set on October 21st, the first reports of unconventional weapons usage surfaced from the Ukrainian-Polish border. A low-yield, enhanced radiation device was detonated over a concentration of NATO armor near Reshizov. It was not a city-killer bomb, but it was a bridge crossed. The blast produced a blinding flash that was seen in Krakow, followed by a pulse that fried every unshielded circuit within a 50-mile radius. The escalation ladder had only one rung left. In the ruins of the global internet, a single message was broadcast by a group of rogue scientists. The fire we have lit cannot be quenched by the blood of the young. It was ignored. In the shipyards of Dalian and the factories of the Midwest, the assembly lines moved faster, churning out the drones and missiles that would replace the ones lost the day before. The war was no longer a conflict between nations. It had become an industrial process, a planetary-scale furnace consuming the future to heat the present. The Pacific remained a dark mirror of the Atlantic, with carrier groups playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the islands, waiting for the signal that the Pacific inferno had finally merged with the European pyre to create a single world-consuming flame. By 04 on October 22nd, the hour of uncertainty had descended upon the Western Pacific, a psychological and operational fog where the distinction between a sensor ghost and a killing blow had effectively vanished. Following the silent escalation in the Arctic, the Pacific theater became a dense grid of electronic signatures where over 300 vessels from a dozen nations moved in a state of silent anticipation. In Honolulu, the Indo-Pacific Command had already initiated Operation Aegis Vigil, a defensive mobilization that mirrored the historic Operation Sentinel Vow. 3 carrier strike groups, The USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Carl Vinson, and the USS Abraham Lincoln formed a staggered line of steel 200 miles east of the first island chain, their radars scanning for the first hint of Operation Iron Current. The order was simple: hold position and engage only upon direct attack, a command that masked the terrifying reality that modern naval warfare begins in the electromagnetic spectrum long before a missile is ever seen. The friction point ignited near the Bashi Channel. A Chinese Type 055 destroyer, the Nanchang, accompanied by two Type 054A frigates, had been shadowing the Lincoln Group for 48 hours. At 11:42, a U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon patrol aircraft, call sign Sentry 44, detected a faint sonar trail consistent with a Yuan-class submarine moving silently toward the carrier's inner screen. The rules of engagement allowed only for soft pressure and acoustic challenges, but as the Milwaukee incident had proven, restraint was a fragile barrier. When the American destroyer USS Higgins transmitted an underwater warning for the unidentified contact to surface, the response was not a radio signal, but the chilling scream of an active sonar ping targeting the ship's hull. Seconds later, the torpedo in the water alarm split the bridge of the Higgins. Two acoustic decoys were launched, and while the torpedoes detonated harmlessly on the countermeasures, the fragile restraint of the Pacific had finally collapsed. The escalation was instantaneous and mechanical. Unlike the wars of the previous century, there were no formal declarations, only the unrestricted retaliation of automated systems. By nightfall, the Polypian Sea was no longer a transit zone, but a minefield beneath the surface populated by autonomous drone carriers and silent diesel-electric hunters. In Beijing, the Central Military Commission approved the transition to Conditions Scarlet, authorizing saturation missile strikes against logistical nodes. The world's population watched through flickering networks as satellite imagery revealed the white scars of DF-21D carrier killers streaking across the atmosphere. On the deck of the Abraham Lincoln, Captain Laura Keating, a veteran of the previous Pacific skirmishes, watched as her Aegis operators struggled to filter out the white noise of Chinese broadband jammers that were flooding U.S. communications with static. The first direct hit occurred at 1822 when a YJ-83 anti-ship missile launched from a Chinese frigate struck the port bow of an American destroyer. The explosion killed 14 sailors and left the vessel dead in the water, a smoking relic of the retaliation front.
The conflict soon moved from the sea into the skies over the Taiwan Strait, entering a phase intelligence analysts called the swarm transition. Dozens of unidentified reconnaissance drones, both American RQ-180s and Chinese GJ-6s, mirrored each other's flight paths in a lethal dance of electronic interference. When a Chinese drone lost its link and crashed, Beijing declared it a deliberate act of aggression, and the information war shed all remaining restraint. At air bases in Okinawa and Guam, F-35 squadrons launched continuous combat patrols, their pilots operating under DEFCON 2 conditions. The first direct air-to-air exchange occurred when a pair of U.S. RC-135 reconnaissance planes were intercepted by Chinese J-16 fighters. The maneuvers were aggressive, involving close passes within 50 meters and the release of flares into the American plane's slipstream. A minor collision between a Chinese jet and an American wing sensor caused the J-16 to lose power and spiral into the sea, an accidental catastrophe that served as the final spark for a full-scale air campaign. By April 25th, the scale of the Pacific Inferno had surpassed all historical precedents of naval combat since 1945. The Thunder Coast operation was in full swing, with Chinese missile batteries in Fujian and Ningbo launching salvos aimed at Kadena Air Base and the port of Subic Bay. The skies turned white with contrails as SM-3 interceptors streaked upward to meet the descending warheads. Some were intercepted in radiant flashes high above the Pacific, but others broke through, destroying hangars and fuel depots with surgical precision. The human cost was devastating. In a single night of chaos and confusion, over 400 lives were lost across the fleet. In Washington, the National Security Council debated invoking the War Powers Resolution, yet even as they spoke, the machines of war had gained their own momentum. Autonomous drone carriers began launching hundreds of small, explosive-laden vessels that swarmed the remaining surface ships, guided by ghosts and algorithms that no command authority could easily stop. As the first week of the undeclared war drew to a close, the Pacific had been transformed beyond recognition. Smoke hung over the water where symbols of deterrence like the Japanese destroyer Maya had been reduced to drifting fuel slicks and silence. Communications were strained, and radar screens crowded with the wreckage of a civilization that had assumed the other side would blink. Instead, they faced a chain reaction where every radar lock and false echo carried the potential to ignite a global abyss. The world watched in disbelief as the Pacific Fleet, once the guarantor of global trade, pulled back to regroup, leaving the ocean to the moving ghosts of signals and shadows. The question that haunted every command center from Pearl Harbor to Nanjing was no longer how to win, but how to survive a conflict that had become the world's test.
By the morning of April 26th, the conflict had ascended into a realm where human intent was no longer the primary driver of events. The Pacific Inferno had merged with the European Pyre, creating a planetary-scale disaster that military historians would later struggle to categorize. The transition was marked by the Hour of Uncertainty, a period where the global command and control infrastructure began to fracture under the weight of its own complexity. In the silent, vacuum-sealed corridors of U.S. Space Command, technicians watched in horror as the first anti-satellite, or ASAT, missiles were launched from the Jichuan site in the Chinese interior. These were not weapons designed to kill people, but to kill the eyes of the modern world. 2 American early warning satellites were struck with kinetic kill vehicles, shattering them into thousands of high-velocity fragments. This created an immediate Kessler syndrome, a cloud of orbital debris that began a chain reaction, shredding commercial communication arrays and weather monitors in a blind, mechanical frenzy. Within hours, the GPS constellation began to flicker and fail. Across the globe, the blue dots on billions of smartphones vanished, and with them, the ability of modern civilization to navigate itself. As the orbital shells filled with wreckage, the war on the surface entered a phase of condition scarlet, unrestricted retaliation, where the goal was no longer strategic victory, but the denial of control to the enemy. In the Atlantic, the remnants of the NATO fleet, having survived the initial Arctic skirmishes, found themselves navigating by sextant and stars as their digital links to the Pentagon were severed by the orbital blackout. In the Pacific, the destruction of the eyes in the sky meant that naval commanders were operating in a fog of war deeper than any seen since the 1940s. At 09, a U.S. Navy submarine, acting under standing emergency authority to demonstrate strategic resolve, launched 4 Trident II D5 missiles from a hidden position in the Central Pacific. To the panicked world, this looked like the end. However, these missiles were equipped with conventional high-explosive warheads. They detonated in a remote area near the Marshall Islands, a demonstration strike intended to signal that the nuclear threshold was being watched, even if it was being leaned against with terrifying force. The message was unmistakable, but the response was not diplomatic. It was systemic. The world's financial markets, already reeling from the Great Blackout, suffered a total and terminal collapse. In London, Tokyo, and New York, the flickering screens of the stock exchanges went dark as the undersea cables, the literal nervous system of the global economy, began to be cut by deep-sea submersibles. Russia declared a state of armed neutrality, massing its remaining divisions along its eastern and western borders, while India and Australia entered a state of high alert, effectively turning the Indian Ocean into a closed lake. Civilian life across the Pacific Rim had descended into a struggle for the basics of existence: fuel, food, and information.
In Seoul and Shanghai, crowds that had once chanted blood for blood were now silent, standing in long lines for water, their faces illuminated only by the distant glow of burning refineries.
By April 28th, the retaliation front had reached a state of terminal exhaustion. The machines of war, though autonomous and lethal, were running out of fuel and targets. The Pacific Ocean, once a vibrant artery of global trade, had become a graveyard of 27 ships, their charred hulls drifting in the currents between Hawaii and the Asian coast. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and static, a physical manifestation of the thousands of drones and missiles that had been expended in the previous week. On the bridges of the remaining warships, like the crippled Abraham Lincoln, the crews worked in a state of disbelief. They had followed their lawyers' instructions and their automated targeting systems only to find themselves alone in a silent sea. The war had not ended with a final battle or a signature on a treaty. It had simply run out of momentum, leaving behind a world transformed beyond recognition. In Washington, President Dahlman addressed the nation for the final time that week. His voice, transmitted over emergency radio bands and crackling shortwave, was drawn and measured. He did not speak of victory or of the rules of the world. Instead, he spoke of a struggle for survival and a world's test. In Beijing, a similar address was given, hinting at negotiation through neutral intermediaries, a tacit admission that the architects of the blockade had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. The fleets began a slow, agonizing withdrawal to their home ports, moving through waters littered with life jackets, oil drums, and fragments of plating. As the last day of April dawned, a heavy silence hung over the command centers of the world, mirroring the silence of the Pacific. There were no victory parades, no territories had changed hands. The first island chain remained exactly where it had always been, but it was now a landscape of relics of escalation. The digital world was gone, replaced by a flickering, fragmented reality, where humanity was forced to look at itself without the shield of its technology. The question that remained, whispering across the empty decks of the ghost ships, was the only one that mattered for the survivors. When does deterrence become destruction? The answer was written in the drifting fuel slicks and the silent wreckage of the new century, a warning that the next time the machines were set in motion, there might be no one left to hear the silence that followed.